welcome and thank you for joining our session today on accelerating connections. As you'll see in a minute, we're going to be mainly focusing on technical limits and one of the changes that are being introduced through some industry work that hopefully will actually help some people get connected a little bit quicker. So do you want to just flip on to the next slide, Lottie, or maybe I should take control? Thank you. So just in terms of housekeeping, sort of usual things on webinars, please, if you can. I think we've muted you all just to keep the background noise down. It's probably best for just people's bandwidth, keeping videos off. We'll be using the chat for questions that people can actually type any questions into the chat. We've got some material to go through, as you'll see, and then we've probably got some time at the end, so we'll probably leave most of the questions, even if they're coming into the chat at the end, just so we can make sure we get through all the material. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and we want to record it so we can actually put it on the website, just in case anybody is unable to make it today. So if we flip on to the next slide. So this is what we're going to cover today. We've got a guest, Mike Oxenham from the ESO, has joined us to actually cover the ESO's 5-point plan that actually sets the scene in some of the sort of strategic changes that are being made to try and speed up connections. Then we're going to cover the similar 3-point plan that the DNO have devised, that again is in similar territory. And then the bulk of the presentation will be going through the actual technical limits, which is one of those initiatives that's been developed through these plans. And we'll talk about that to try and explain it, and then about the implementation. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So if we flip on. And so people will obviously be able to introduce themselves at the start, but if you haven't guessed, I'm Brian Hoy. I'm Electricity Northwest Head of Market Regulation, and I'll be just sort of acting as MC and compare today and help manage the questions. So we've got, as I said, Mike Oxenham from the ESO is going to be starting us off in a sec to cover the ESO's 5-point plan, and then Dan Randalls will be picking up the DNO's 3-point plan and the technical limits, and then Stephen Jones will be covering the implementation. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Brian. So for those that don't know me already, I'm Mike Oxenham. I'm the Connections Design Team Manager within the ESO. So primarily I'm focusing on connections reform, which is our longer term work looking at a reformed connections process, as opposed to our 5-point plan, which is looking at a suite of tactical changes. So I'm only briefly going to touch on connections reform today. And the bulk of this 10-minute slot or so is going to be just talking through where we are with our 5-point plan and what is in there. So before I go on to the aspects of the 5-point plan, it might be worth just providing a little bit of context. So many of you will have seen this slide before, maybe an older version of it with the volume of connections applications we're seeing at the moment and historically in relation to requests for access to the transmission system. So as you can see from the graph on the left, year upon year, we're seeing a considerably higher number of connection applications coming through, with last year's being distinctly higher than previous years. And then you can see this year's also tracking above last year's, but also significantly above prior years too. So just showing that there's a lot of interesting connections. It's carrying on getting higher and higher as we move forward, and we can't see anything at the moment which is showing us that that's slowing down. And then if you look at the graph on the right, that is translating into gigawatts in the contracted background from a transmission perspective. So above 400 gigawatts contracted now, with an increase of over 100 gigawatts over the past 5 months. So considerably more than you might expect, and what some of our future energy scenarios forecast for what is required effectively across the various scenarios. So in terms of the queue, as I said, connections queue still growing, higher and higher applications. Some of that linked to acceptance rates. So the other thing to note is that acceptance rates are falling in turn. So we're processing a lot more applications, but as a proportion, the people who are accepting those are going down, likely because of the connection dates being offered, we assume. Bottom left graph showing what the background is composed of, and bottom right showing that the connection dates being offered are going out well into the future now, with more and more going into the later connection dates because of the volume in the contracted background. So that sets the scene around why we're taking action both in the longer term strategic space and the nearer term tactical space. So in terms of the 5-point plan, I should expect 5 areas to this plan. So the first is tech amnesty, then construction plan assumptions review, treatment of storage, queue management, and non-firm offer development. So I'll briefly touch on each of these in turn. I'm not going to talk through the slides. I'll talk around them. So please read through the slide as I'm talking for further information. So in terms of the tech amnesty, this is the first aspect of this, which is had a clear impact. So we received 8.1 gigawatts worth of applications that closed a while ago now, and we've recently had support from Ofgem in relation to progressing with that and the cost associated with that. Due to the time between us asking for interest and concluding, and due to changes in projects who had expressed an interest for various reasons, basically some of that which had expressed an interest has dropped out in the final stage. So the final number is 4.1 gigawatts. So relative to what's in the contracted background, a small number, but 4.1 gigawatts is 4.1 gigawatts. So that will be going back into the pot along with some of the other benefits through the 5-point plan for reallocation. So we're likely to stop updating on this now that we have the final figure, and it's just administrative contracting side of things to get those capacities out of the contracted background formally so it can be reallocated. Next area is on construction plan assumption review and treatment of storage. So as a considerable percentage of projects which are contracted don't go on to connect, and as historically we haven't modelled storage in a way which aligns with how it behaves in the market, through those two things we've undertaken something called the transmission works review, which is looking to restudy what is in the contracted background based on people who have expressed an interest to potentially advance, to see whether we can remove enabling works from those contracts and bring forward connection dates. So that piece of work's ongoing. We expect to conclude that work within the next couple of months, so we can start telling people who have benefited from that review that there's a potential for an earlier connection date. So this is looking at firm connection dates. It potentially could benefit embedded projects as well as directly connected projects. We don't know the scale of the impact and which projects are going to be impacted, but we'll be able to communicate that with developers and DNOs in the near future, so that if there is a project who can potentially be advanced, then you will be made aware in due course. The next area is queue management, where we're expecting a decision from Ofgem on the 10th of November. And that will allow us to put milestones in contracts, which you may be familiar with already from the distribution side of things, but from the transmission access side of things, we don't currently have those in the contracts. So we're expecting a decision to allow us to start putting those contractual milestones in contracts and managing against those milestones again, to remove projects that aren't progressing from the queue, so that projects who are progressing will be able to utilise the capacity which has been made available. And the last area is in relation to non-firm offer development. So as part of this, and on the back of an update we published around our approach to allocating this to storage developers who've expressed an interest, we've been working on the policy associated with this and how we put it into practice, and we're about to launch tranche 1 of this area of the 5-point plan, where there are around 20 customers with around 10 gigawatts worth in total, where they can potentially connect earlier if they accept the offer, with clauses in those contracts to allow us to manage this non-firmness in the event that those developers aren't behaving in the way we expected. So the exact details of this really come down to the contracts around when things are impacted by the non-firmness, but that's what we're effectively picking up in the first tranche, and we'll be looking to deploy this elsewhere in subsequent tranches too. So this aspect is also moving forward to unlock capacity for projects. So there are other areas beyond these 5 areas. So we're considering letters of authority potentially on the back of our reform consultation. We're also planning to publish final recommendations from our connections reform project in November. We're waiting to see what comes out through the connections action plan from DNOs and Ofgem. So beyond the 5-point plan, there's a lot going on too, looking into the future. But hopefully we're going to start to see some positive impacts coming out of the 5-point plan work in the next couple of months in terms of creating and unlocking capacity and advancing connection dates. So I can take any questions at the end, and I'm going to hand over now for the next bit of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So just to introduce myself, my name is Dan Randalls. I'm the Head of Strategic Planning at Electricity North West. So just wanted to give you a very brief overview of the work that the ENA are doing. Mike outlined just previously there the work that National Grid are doing within the ESO, specifically around its tactical plan, looking more at the short-term kind of initiatives that will help alleviate to some extent some of the challenges that we're facing. The ENA, to get all the DNOs came together with the ENA, supported by National Grid, to look at what can be done at the distribution level, working alongside the transmission operator to help manage some of the impacts on distribution customers. Clearly, when customers want to connect to distribution network, very often that requires the network operator to request an impact assessment from National Grid to facilitate that connection. So distribution customers were being impacted by some of the issues being faced at the transmission level. So the ENA's 3-point plan was to try to understand what could be done within the distribution companies to help alleviate those challenges, but particularly to establish that coordination with the ESO and the work it was doing on its 5-point plan. So that group's been active now for around about 12 months or so, looking at kind of pulling together a number of different kind of initiatives. They've been categorized into these 3 broad areas. We're going to be concentrating mainly today around action, or what's coming out of action 2 in the 3-step plan, which is looking at how the kind of coordination between the transmission and the distribution companies. There's a number of kind of initiatives which fall under action 2, but just also a reminder, it's not for today, but just for context, the strategic connections group within the A are also looking at how distribution companies can better manage any queues that are forming on the distribution network, looking at dealing with any projects that are slow moving or are just not progressing, that are holding up other projects that are queued behind them, and also looking at different ways in which those queues can be better optimized. That's in action 1, and in action 3, looking specifically at how distribution network operators manage the connection of energy storage, mainly battery energy storage, and some of the assumptions that are made regarding the impact of batteries on distribution networks. So that's currently the activity within that group. That group's going to continue to work going forward, and new initiatives will be brought on, will be introduced as we move forward. Just very quickly, this is the delivery plan. I'm not going to go into too much detail. We will share these slides after the webinar, but you can very much see that now we're in November. All 3 of those groups are entering into the implementation phase. and again, that's what Stefan will talk you through how ENW intends to implement the technical limits. Okay, so technical limits, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I've got a series of slides here which just introduce the kind of concept technically of these new limits, kind of what they are, and then we've got some slides which attempt to illustrate how technical limits will be applied at a typical grid supply point, kind of what that looks like, and identify the kind of benefits or the opportunity that the use of technical limits brings to DNOs and to customers wanting to connect to the distribution network. So just very briefly, a reminder of the current arrangement. So any customers that wish to connect to the distribution network, as I've already alluded to, will need to the DNO needs to apply to the ESO for an impact assessment to be performed to understand what the impact might be on the transmission system. Depending upon the outcome of that assessment, the National Grid will place that customer in a category in a document which is called the bilateral connection agreement. That's the agreement between the DNO and the ESO. There's one of those for each GSP. And essentially customers are tabulated in what's called the Appendix G, or App G as it's sometimes referred to. You might have heard it referred to that. And there are essentially 4 parts of the App G as listed there, parts 1 through to 4. Parts 1 are customers that are already connected to the network, happily generating. Part 2 are those that have been given permission to connect to the network, and they will usually either be connected or have a date, a very within the not too distant future to connect. And then you get these parts 3 and 4 where the customer can neither connect but has got some form of conditions governing its connection, usually some kind of output restrictions under certain scenarios on the National Grid. And then crucially, which is the purpose of today's discussion, is around these customers that actually can't connect to the distribution network because the National Grid has identified a requirement to do upgrades on the wider system. So just to be clear, these are works that are not local. They're not necessarily local works. They're typically major overhead line restringing that the National Grid needs to do on its transmission system, and these customers have been identified as being sat behind those works. So typically what you'll see in some instances of these customers in Part 4 having connection dates out to 2037. So technical limits, kind of what is it? So starting next month in November, the ESO will be introducing technical limits. We'll be making these available to all DNOs at qualifying GSPs. They're essentially a megawatt value or megawatt values, and they represent the minimum and maximum kind of operating envelope at a particular GSP. Okay, so these are the power flows across those transformers, the minimum and maximum at any particular point in time at that GSP. The limits are calculated by the ESO, and it uses data within its AppG Part 1 and Part 2 customers. So these are the ones that are connected or consented to connect. And then it also looks at the minimum demand at that GSP. This is the demand data that's provided by the DNO during the annual data exchange process. And it uses that information, ESO uses that information to work out what these net power flows are on the wider transmission system. Should customers that qualify for taking advantage of technical limits wish to choose so, it's not compulsory, clearly a choice, then essentially would allow those customers currently sat in Part 4, Part Q behind wider works, to connect in advance of those works being completed. The condition of that offer is it's non-firm. which means you could be interrupted. And if you are interrupted, then that is on an uncompensated basis. The principle being that that is a temporary arrangement, and once National Grid has performed the associated transmission reinforcements, then these customers would progress into part 2 of the ART-G, and those constraints would drop away, and they would have firm access. The DNO is required to ensure that any customers that do take advantage of technical limits operate such that they don't breach those limits, and if at any point that the limits are breached, then the DNO would need to take an action to essentially curtail or interrupt the relevant DER. What you'll find as you're engaging with different DNOs on technical limits, there's different ways in which organisations are rolling out kind of the actual infrastructure required to manage technical limits. Within ENW, we'll be taking advantage of our network management system. We have an application in there coming on stream soon called the Active Network Management. So that's how we will implement technical limits, and that will operate in conjunction with equipment installed at the customer interface to ensure that we can operate within those limits. So just a few slides which try to bring this concept of technical limits a bit more alive. So what we've got here is a demand profile for a GSP. This is like an annual demand profile, and you can see that within that 12-month period, the demand fluctuates quite significantly, from day to day, but also as we move through the various seasons, with a minimum demand obviously in the summer period, and the demand increasing as we get into the winter period, but quite sizable variations in the level of demand, particularly actually during that winter period. So what we can see here now, we can superimpose upon that demand profile the this concept of an operating envelope, these maximum and minimum power flows that are available at that particular GSP. So what you can see in the red line towards the bottom there is essentially what is called the kind of export limit. So as more and more generation is connected to the distribution network, that has, in a sense, the effect of reducing the net power flows across the transformer. So what we would call the net demand is essentially reduced. So that's essentially what we're trying to ensure that we don't breach those limits as we bring those Part 4 customers on to the network on a managed basis. We will do so to ensure that we don't breach those limits. But what you can see here on this illustration is that there's quite a sizable amount of capacity headroom that is available between the current minimum demand at this particular GSP and the minimum power flows that are available at that GSP. So that headroom is what would be potentially available to customers that are currently sat in Part 4. Now, the whole concept here is that we're taking capacity that has been made available by National Grid, but is currently not being utilised. So this will be by customers that are in Part 4 that have been given a connection date and are able to connect, but for various reasons just haven't yet connected. They may well still be pursuing approvals, or maybe on a kind of long duration build out, particularly for large scale 132 kV connections. But at some stage, those customers will eventually connect. And what this chart tries to illustrate here is what the effect of a large Part 2 customer connecting has on the materiality or the headroom that's available at that GSP. So you can see the blue line was the original demand profile, and then the orange line is the effect that the connection of, in this instance, a battery currently in part 2, what the impact will be on the demand when the battery connects. And you can see that the majority of the headroom that was available has now disappeared because the battery is now connected, although there is still some headroom remaining. It's just not as much as previously. This tries to show you the extent of variability within a typical day. So we saw previously the demand over a 12-month period, and there's quite a significant amount of volatility within that period. But so if we zoom into a typical day, this is a day during the minimum period of the year, so probably in the early part of the summer. You can see that even during that period, within that 24-hour cycle, there's quite a sizable change in the amount of headroom that's available, usually a 100 megawatt change in headroom. So that gives perhaps a sense of the level of opportunity that is available here for customers that are in part 4. So just going back to our annual view of things, just trying to step through how this might actually work. So if you've got a situation where we've got some customers that are already connected, so these will have been part 1 or part 2 customers that are already connected, in this instance, relatively small scale solar and a 22 megawatt fossil gas oil generators. They're already connected, so they're already in the background, forming that blue curve that we've got there. And then we've got this rather large 95 megawatt battery that's been consented to connect. National Grid have provided the approval to connect, but that battery is not connected. It's currently sat in that part 2, waiting to build out, etc. And then we've got a number of projects that are queued up behind wider transmission system work. So these are the part 4 projects, and you can see we've got 4 of those, largely BESS, different sizes, alongside a relatively large scale, actually, solar generator. So that's actually quite typical of the sort of queues that are starting to form on distribution networks, queuing behind transmission works. So the whole concept here is, because the 95 megawatt battery hasn't yet connected, there is essentially today capacity available. And what we'll be doing with technical limits is reaching out to customers that are currently in part 4 and having a discussion with them about their appetite to take advantage of technical limits and bring forward their connection, albeit on a non-firm basis. Okay, so we'll obviously have questions at the end of the presentation, but I'll hand over to Stefan, who's going to talk a little bit more about the implementation of technical limits.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon. Stefan Jones. I head up the connections quotations team. So whenever you're dealing with applications, you'll be dealing with my team, and obviously we'll be helping you through the first stages of this technical limits process. So when we look at how technical limits is going to be phased or going to be rolled out, the first part of that was the ESO and the DNOs looking at how best to approach the various GSPs. So the whole process has been broken down into phases. Phase 1, phase 1A, if you like, is looking at sole use GSPs only. That means the GSP is only an interface between ourselves and National Grid and not with any other party involved. And initially, where there are no fault level concerns, because obviously technical limits work a lot easier where that's not a problem. We currently have 5 GSPs that meet those criteria. We're going to go into this in a little bit more detail in a bit, but they're on the slide there for anybody that is interested: Bredbury, Kersley, South Manchester, Penwortham and Kirby. We also have 3, potentially 4, that are currently going through a project progression. Now, because they're going through that process, they won't come out in the initial phase, but we're hoping to see them in the first quarter of next year. So this first group is what everybody's been looking at up to date, and as mentioned earlier, the target for that is November. It's this month, and we will be talking to customers in those GSP groups over the next week or so. National Grid nationally are looking at a phase 1B, which will follow that first part, and that's where their sole use GSPs with current fault level concerns. Now, at the moment, NWL don't have any GSPs, grid supply points, that fall into that criteria. So our next phase will be phase 2, and phase 2 is looking at the complex sites, or the infrastructure sites, where there's more than just the 2 parties involved. And we do have 3 key sites like that: Harker, Hutton and Heysham. They will initially start to get looked at and plans put in place at the beginning of next year. We actually have big works involved at all 3 of those, and we won't be able to implement the technical limits until those works have been complete, but we'll hopefully know more about it ahead of that date. So initially we're going to look at the phase 1A implementation. That's the implementation that the understanding is going to come quite soon. We have included in this slide pack, so that it's easy to reference in the future when you get access to these, just a quick summary of where each of our 16 GSPs fall. Now, at the moment of those 16, we have 4 without Part 4 customers, so they're obviously outside of the technical limits process. But as I say, this is a snapshot today, and things are always going to be changing. So schemes will move into different parts, and things will be moving along, shall we say. There are 2 GSPs in Spen that interconnect into our network, but again, those are not heavily utilized at the moment. So that's there for your reference. And then what's going to happen next? So as I say, we're going to look at the Part 1A GSPs. There's 5 of them initially. We are expecting to have the information on those limits available for our review and onward dissemination in the next few days, so we can start talking to everybody through November. We acknowledge that there was an expression of interest phase run by National Grid on the whole 5-point plan and accelerating connections a while ago. We're going to do something a little bit similar, but just for these phase 1A 5 substations. That will open in the coming week and will run to the end of November. And we'll basically be contacting each party that would be eligible to go into those technical limit operations on each of those GSPs, and checking if they're interested, talking to them about dates, talking to them about plans, and also discussing what may or may not be required over and above current processes, designs, to enable that to happen. As Dan mentioned earlier, this will work through the interface at the site between our control system and your control system. And to help with that, we will be running another webinar, which is on the 14th of November. Now that webinar will just be for those schemes on those 5 GSPs that are in phase 1A, because obviously there's a priority to get that moving. We will probably run another one in the coming months for people that are sitting in phase 1A2, phase 1B, phase 2. Just to let everybody know exactly the bigger details that will be coming. In this webinar and in these letters that will be coming out, we'll look to explain the technical limits in a little bit more detail than we have today, and how they will work, what access might be available, look at the projects in the queues, and have the opportunity to ask and answer some more detailed questions. So that's how we're going to be working. As Dan mentioned, this will all work through the control system that we will be implementing, and that will be a factor. And I've lost my train of thought, sorry. So all this will come into what we need to talk about with each of you and able to understand how we're going to get the ability for you to connect into this process. So the initial communications to those schemes that are viable for the first phase will come out, as I say, in the next week, and then by the 14th of November you'll have been invited to this next webinar. So obviously now we're going to be moving into any more detailed questions. And some of those we'll be able to deal with today. Some of those may have to wait for the next webinar or follow-up communication. But I'm going to hand back to Brian.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Dan and Mike as well. Thank you for that. Yeah, we'll just try. There's a few questions that have come through in the chat. We'll just try and cover some of those quite briefly. Some are maybe not just directly on technical limits, but we'll try and cover them quickly. So the first one from Morgan was about, will you guys consider all battery connections already contracted and new yet to be applied in a new way now, or just the new ones? So I think maybe Dan can pick up. But we changed our policy back in April. So I think the approach that we've been taking is a change since then, but not been applied to everything since April. But did you want to expand on that anymore, Dan?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Brian. I think we made quite a significant change to our policy around the connection of batteries to the networks. We made quite a significant change. That freed up quite a lot of capacity. In total, 1 gigawatt of additional capacity across our entire network was made as a result of that change. So that's been in play now since April. So any connection offers that have been made since 1st of April will have been against that new background. We will only be able to take advantage of the technical limits once we have the agreement signed with National Grid. Hopefully we'll be able to get them all signed and in place during this month in November, and then, as Stefan says, we'll be approaching the Part 4 customers impacted in phase 1A and having those bilateral discussions with them directly.
Okay, thank you. So Mike, just one about when will the ESO make a firm decision on letters of authority? I don't know whether you know the timescale for that.
No, we don't have a date in terms of when we're doing it. If we do it, we're going to be making final recommendations on all of the reform proposals in November. That area was generally supported, and there was a lot of useful suggestions around how we do it. So we're working through those and pulling together a bit more thinking in relation to detailed process design for that one. So no timescales, but we're actively working on the next level of detail now prior to making final recommendations on the whole thing next month.
Okay, thank you. Probably one for Stefan. How does one find out which part of Appendix G that their project sits in?
Right, so when your project's gone through the transmission impact assessment, you'll be notified of the outcome of that, and that outcome notification will explain what part of your what part of the Appendix G you'll be going into. What we can do and what we will be doing, especially for the first 5, is reiterate to customers where they are. But as I say, initially you'll have had that notification through once your project has passed its TIA. Now, after the introduction of the 2-step process, that clearly won't happen until the end of the 2nd step. So for recent acceptances, that's going to take a little bit of time. For the older acceptances, we can chase that down on a case-by-case basis for you if you can't find or don't have easy access to the original notification.
Okay, thank you. And not sure whether we'll be down on this one. How are customers in Part 3 affected by the new technical limits approach?
Yes, so they're not impacted at all by technical limits, Brian. So this applies specifically to those customers that are currently queued behind wider transmission works. So they're currently only Part 4 customers.
Yeah. So they're just completely neutral too, because they're not actually held up, are they? Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Right. If a customer has a hybrid project, e.g., EV and BESS under the same grid connection, how will you make sure that only the DG element, i.e., BESS, is impacted by the technical limit solution? Will meter dispensation be used so that only the DG element of the connection is controlled and not the full connection, which could include EV chargers, etc.? So I don't know. Anybody happy to?
I think that was that about hybrid connections.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess we'll have to look at these on a case by case basis. I guess the principle here is that it's only the generation component that we're looking to kind of manage, rather than the sort of any kind of associated demand or anything. So we just need to sort of tease that out really to make sure that first of all, that customer needs to be in Part 4. So to get them into Part 4, we have to submit that application to National Grid, and I guess it's in that process of submitting the application that we need to explain to the ESO what this customer is actually all about and these hybrid arrangements, and therefore it'll be reflected correctly in the app G once it's been through the TIA. So that's how I'd expect it to work. But I suspect once we've actually done one of those, we'll have a better feel for it. But I think the principle is absolutely, as you say, this is about the generation component. Yeah,
and a simple levy, you'd expect will probably only be initiating any sort of constraint if they were exporting. So the level of constraint we'd want them to sort of turn down would be on the export. That customer would need to work out how they were actually doing that in the background with their kit. So yeah, it's one that people need to actually evaluate if they are eligible Part 4 ones to actually look at. Okay, what's this in battery operating profile in this Bredbury example? I don't know, Dan, do you know what was? I think that orange bit was just the.
It was purely illustrative, Brian, on it. I mean, I think when National Grid are doing its work, working out what the technical limits are, they've got some detailed kind of models which look at the contributions of different technology types and kind of what their level of overall kind of contribution and utilization will be. So batteries will be treated differently than, for example, synchronous form of generation or wind or solar, etc. So that's all kind of baked into the calculation used by the ESO in setting the limits. That Bredbury example was just merely illustrative to show how when the Part 2 customer eventually does connect, how that could impact the level of headroom available. And that's important for Part 4 customers because they're going to have face of choice. They either they can bring their connection forward, but they need to understand that comes with some risk, because it's a non-firm uncompensated arrangement. So I think working with the DNO, if you're a Part 4 customer, working with the DNO and understanding for your GSP what this materiality is and how Part 2 is currently formed is going to be an important part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, I was just sort of flipping back to this and this sort of example, which are the kind of the real capacities. There you've got what, about just over 210 megawatts of extra generation to connect, but it all depends when they are trying to export. If they're not coincident, actually all of them would sit under that, at the very worst you've got 100 megawatt threshold, so any one of them can operate, possibly in combination 2 or 3. As long as they're not coincident, they all could be connected and happily exporting, not quite to their heart's content, but if they don't end up being coincident, then they'll not breach the technical limits and in practice then wouldn't actually get constrained. So it'll very much depend, almost not what assumptions we make, but just how they actually operate in practice as to what the impact will be. So we'll not know that until it actually happens.
I think that's correct, and I think the the slide on the daily profile shows that even within day, there's quite significant change in the headroom availability during that period. So it, in some sense depends on when that generator is actually looking to export as well. Yeah. So I think this is part of the learning for customers. We need to, how does the DNO make this information available so that customers can make these choices? Yeah.
Okay. So Pete asked, how will final demand customers be able to benefit from technical limits? There are a number of GSPs across the country where battery import is blocking normal demand customers, e.g. housing, commercial, industrial, EV charging, etc. from proceeding. But final demand customers don't appear in Appendix G and so can't be allocated to technical limits. Also, final demand customers will find it much harder to be flexible than a generator or a storage customer. I mean, I'll start, maybe Dan or Stefan can add. I think this is, I don't think we've got any GSPs are in that situation where we've got a blockage on demand. All the ones I think where we've got constraints are all export, and therefore what this proposition is doing is just trying to bring forward some of those generation connections, or sort of exporting generations that are in Part 4. So it's kind of neutral. We don't have that problem, Pete, in terms of any demand connections being held up. So I guess it might be more relevant to some other DNOs, but I don't think it's a particular issue for us. I don't know whether Dan, there's anything more you'd want to.
I think the only thing to say on this one, I think, Brian, is just kind of almost like signposting within that SCG, the ENA Strategic Connections Group. One of the work streams was looking specifically about on batteries and the assumptions that distribution network operators should be looking to make with regard to the impact of batteries on the network, and also around some of the access rights and opportunities there for different connection arrangements. So I'd perhaps signpost that quite a lot of work there, and that work stream has got its own engagement with customers. So I think webinars have either been held or will be held in the not too distant future to talk through some of the proposals that are coming out of that group. What I would just say is that within ENW for some time now, we've been we consider that but we don't include the demand element of, for instance, a battery within our P27 assessments. So we know some DNOs do that, and that can drive reinforcement requirements or block capacity for other customers. So we don't do that, and we also treat them as like a non-firm type connection arrangement anyway, as we do with all generators. So I think we're probably in a different situation within ENW. I don't think we see that, as you point out, we're not seeing that on our network.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Will all new connection offers automatically be considered for technical limits, or is it only going to be offered to eligible customers with existing connection offers? So in this first tranche, it will be existing. So it's existing customers that are in Part 4. I think we probably expect that this will be something that we'll be able to use for a while. So if there are other customers that are still going through project progression, for example, or even come in as a new application now, then I suspect it's likely that it will be used in the future. But the first part of this is actually on the specific ones that have got offers that are curtailed and are held up in Part 4. You mentioned A&M is key factor here, but ENW is not that progressed in this area as other DNOs. What's the implementation plan? We'll probably not cover that in detail now. I mean, I think our approach to A&M is probably sort of fundamentally different to the other DNOs. So I think all the other DNOs have ended up doing sort of effectively sort of tactical deployment of individual GSPs. Our approach that's, and I'll be able to maybe help you with the dates in a sec, will actually be available to all GSPs. So when it goes, it'll be company wide across all our GSPs. So we'll kind of go from zero to having the full impact. Do you know what the latest is in terms of timescales, Dan, by any chance?
So that is currently in testing now, the application. So just can build upon what you've said, Brian. We will implement the functionality within our control room management system, our network management system, which is a fundamentally different approach than has been taken by other DNOs that have used infrastructure installed within the substation itself, local. In this instance, it would be the GSP, potentially also associated primaries. So it's a different approach. The software is currently in testing. We're currently working with Schneider Electric, who are the provider, making sure that that is delivered against the specification. In terms of when we make the decision to go live, we're not quite there yet with it. We've got a few things that we just need to sort out, but it is very, very imminent. Probably looking at the early part of 2024, we'll be in a position to start rolling that out at various sites. Yeah, probably as much as we can say at this stage.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, thank you. Then the next couple of questions are probably linked. So will AW be following other DNOs lead and send expressive interest forms to fast track applications due to grid reform? And then so EOI, expressive interest, is only for customers with TIA outcomes in those 5 GSPs. So yeah, that's what we're planning to do, is very specifically looking at the 5 GSPs in the first tranche to get expressions of interest if people are interested in looking to progress those particular jobs forward through the technical limits. As Stefan mentioned, when we get to the next phase, we'll do it. So rather than trying to ask everybody if they're interested now, we're going to do it sort of batch by the phases we've got in front of us, so we can actually deal with those more specifically rather than just a wider expression of interest that people's view might change over time. So next one. So for part 3 customers, how is N-1 managed? Is it by inter-trip rather than A&M? Can TIAs overlap, or do they need to run series one at a time? It's in GSP. Are the Harker fault level limitation issues just on the NW side of Harker, or are they on the transmission side too? I understand Harker's effectively just being built by National Grid, just trying to get a rough feel for timing. So I don't know, Dan, are you able to help with any bits of those? So the part 3 is probably a bit outside the scope of today. I'm just sort of conscious of time, whether we need to pick that up separately.
Sorry, I think yeah, we can pick this up. I think on just very quickly on part 3. We are working with National Grid to understand how we can take advantage of A&M for part 3. So there's a range of different solutions that have been used in the past, both inter-trip and sort of A&M based solutions. So we will be looking to utilise A&M for part 3 customers. That's the plan, but we need to go through some work with National Grid. Fault level limitation. So we talked about that's in the phase 2. So we got within phase 2, I think there was 3 GSPs that have currently got fault level limitations. Harker, Bolton, I can't remember the third one. Where we're looking to work with the ESO to understand how technical limits can be offered there.
Okay.
Just on Harker, that's currently obviously the whole substation there, the National Grid substation, is currently within its T2 price control being completely rebuilt, and that will include the SGTs. I think we're currently expecting that work will be completed around about 2028.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question in the chat is, how is it decided who will be curtailed? I think we haven't made a final decision on this, but Dan, do you want to maybe just share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we're currently working on how best to implement this. So again, within existing kind of principles of like last in, first off, etc., available within Electricity Northwest, we have something called the curtailment index, which we've developed alongside our A&M offering, which actually looks to provide a more kind of equitable share, kind of more sort of fairer sharing of the curtailment kind of burden. So we need to do some further work to understand exactly how that will work, but in principle, we'll be looking to try and share that burden equitably across any part 4 customers that are impacted. So no one customer can takes the brunt of the curtailment. So yeah, more work to do on it, but our principle will be around a more equitable sharing of the curtailment.
Okay, and as you might have noticed, Lottie's put a little just feedback form in the chat, so people, as we're just finishing off, can have a quick look at that and just give us any feedback. That would be useful. But there's another question to come in for hybrid sites, e.g. 49.9 megawatt PV and 49 megawatt BESS. How will this be treated for the technical limits and headroom example in the slide? So I think basically, if I do it simply, and then Dan can come in and correct me, if that was in part 4, they will be given the opportunity to connect early. So if they connected, say, just next week, then so long as those limits that were on, go back to that slide where we had the pictures, so long as it doesn't go under that red line, the total export at the GSP never goes beneath that red line, then they can export to their heart's content. So with the headroom we've seen in that example at Bredbury, if they were at Bredbury, then this looks like pretty much all the time there's 100 megawatts of headroom. So they would be constrainable, but in practice they might not be constrained, depending on when exactly they were exporting. And obviously with the PV, as we saw on this slide, it's middle of the night is the time of lowest demand. So if they are exporting the PV during the daytime, then they may be absolutely fine and not actually curtailed. But it'll be just very much depend on the dynamic situation of the network and the impact of all the other customers at that point in time. So I think there's another question that maybe popped on. Yeah, let's get to those. So if we submit an EOI, will they be contractual, or will the customer be able to review the cost containment, etc., and either accept or not accept the accelerated connection offer? Yeah. So what we're planning to do is it the expressive interest will be, as it says, an expressive interest. So that's not contractually binding. That's just to actually for us to understand whether there are 20 customers or 10 customers or 2 customers that are interested, so we can actually be just more targeted in those discussions. So that's what, as Stefan said, we're going to hold another session in a couple of weeks just for those customers that are effectively in scope of the phase 1A. So we can talk through that more. We can give a bit more detail and answer all those sort of questions. But it's there for people to take up if they wish. If it's not something that's of interest, then that's absolutely fine. There's no compulsion on it. And so we're trying to just make more information available. There'll be questions that people will ask that we've maybe not thought of, and we'll have to work through those in time. But we'll seek to do that. And then the last question in the chat: how the connection space limitations will be dealt with? Lack of spare bay switches or just land? GHM require a whole new sister GSP build.
Do you want me to pick this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stefan.
So this relates to the build that you need to connect to the distribution network. That still stays the same. So if you are requiring a new bay, you will still require a new bay. What we're doing is we're saying we're going to work on accelerating your grid consent. And this is why specifically with Heysham, for example, and Harker and Hutton, those processes won't come into play until the work at Heysham, for example, the reference to the sister GSP is complete, because obviously it can't be done. If you're looking at one of our regions where we've got technical limits in the first phase, for example, South Manchester, there are a number of schemes there that require either an additional circuit breaker or even an additional circuit breaker bay. They will still need to be built, and that will be part of your program into when you can connect onto an accelerated scheme. Now, at the moment, while you've not had a consent date that is in the reasonable near future, where you're out at 2035, 2036, 2037, you won't have started those works. Once we understand technical limits and have these more detailed one-to-one chats, and the next webinar, for example, we will talk to you about your actual construction programs, which will be a reference on the expression of interest.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stefan. So it's just turned 2 o'clock. So I think that was the time we had scheduled, but we managed to get through all the questions in the chat. Hopefully you find that useful. If you can, just spend a minute or two and provide us some feedback just on the link that Lottie sent out in the chat. That would be really helpful. as we've said, we'll be making the slides available, and we'll be putting the recording on the website as well. Yeah, as I say, hope you found it useful, and thank you for joining us today.